Engine is called
A rotating force. Nearly all discussions of transmissions include the word torque and the idea of torque and all that. So what did, Abby, what did you just do with them lugs? With those lug nuts on that car out there, what'd you do? What do you call that? You torqued them. You basically had you a torque and you were torquing them. Okay, when the burning of fuel takes place in the engine cylinder, the pistons and the connecting rods force the crankshaft to turn. Now, that rotary force is called torque. Now, one of the things we talk about in engine principles is the fact that a gasoline engine basically every time a firing event takes place, it's just slapping the crankshaft. Basically, you're just basically slapping the crankshaft. And on a diesel engine, you're basically pumping that crank because it burns all the way down. So you're going to have a lot more torque on a diesel engine than you are a gas burner. But one of the purposes of the driveline is to multiply the torque developed by the engine. Okay, so if you've got a 1-to-1 gear ratio, what gear are you in?
You're in third or fourth.
Yeah, usually third or fourth. I mean, that's your highest, not your highest gear, because the overdrive is a slightly higher gear than 1-to-1 in it. It'll be like 0.75 to 1 or 0.89 to 1 and all that. So, but torque in simple terms is a turning or twisting effort, and when a technician uses a wrench to tighten a bolt, torque's applied to the bolt. So when the bolt's tight, the technician may not be able to turn it anymore. Even though the bolt doesn't turn, the technician is still applying torque. That's a force that tries to twist something, right? That's basically what you're doing there. All right. So now then, we got let me see. What is it? What lets the transmission multiply engine torque? Gear ratios. Okay. All right. Now the term power is often confused with torque. So power is the rate of speed doing work. Rate or speed of doing work. Power adds the idea of time. The more quickly work is done, the more power is involved. You got me? If a horse is connected to a plow, it's plowing a field, it takes that single horse a certain amount of time to plow a field. Yep. Okay. And so if we hitched up 2 horses, we might be able to plow the field in half the time. Got me? So that's because 2 horses have twice as much power being applied to the plow. That's the power part of it. As we describe the operation of the components of the driveline, we will be concerned with the flow of power. That's what we're after here. The flow of power, or power flow, is the path the power takes from the engine to the wheels that drive the vehicle. So we got to understand the power flow through a powertrain component. It's basic to understand how the component works. So that's what we're here for. And Daniel's still got to finish putting my manual transmission back together out there so I can show you that on the bench. All right. Technicians got to understand how the component works to diagnose and repair it properly. Now, here's a little blurb. So somebody comes to you and they say, my transmission, and I'm talking about a rear-wheel drive, and we're just going to start with rear-wheel drive. Okay, it actually does makes noise in every gear except fourth. I mean, it is a whining noise. When I get to fourth, it's quiet, and then I go to fifth, and it's making noise. You'd be surprised how common that is on a manual transmission. Well, I told you before, if a manual transmission is leaking lubricant, you better doggone sure fix it, because it's not easy to check a manual transmission for fluid, and so you're going to feel like it's probably going to be aight. It ain't like pulling the dipstick out of your automatic or pulling the dipstick out of your engine. You got to get under there and you got to take a plug out. You got to make sure there's oil in it. And if it's starting to leak a little bit, next thing you know, in spite of everything that you think you're doing right, it's going to go dry, and it's going to wipe out usually the input shaft bearing, and it's going to wipe out that gear behind it. Now, if you hear one that's making noise in every gear except fourth gear, that bearing right over behind that input shaft, you know, whenever you got that, you pulled your transmission out, you pull that input shaft out, there's a bearing around that input shaft, right? That bearing is the one that's bad. You're going to hear this. Derek, you may hear this. You say, well, that's important to listen to me talk? All right. Now, if you've got this noise that it's making in every gear except fourth, you instantly know you've got that bearing bad. However, if somebody has run that transmission out of fluid, out of oil, and you know, there's all kinds of different oils that go in the transmission. Somebody's run that thing out of transmission oil, it's going to destroy the cluster gear, which is the front gear on that cluster gear. The cluster gear, that front gear, is meshed all the time. The one coming from the engine is meshed all the time with that one. And those two gears will be the first ones that are going to die. They'll turn blue. They'll start to sharpen their teeth off. They'll get noisy. And also, that bearing is going to be destroyed. But I have seen it when nothing was wrong with it except the bearing had gone bad. We used to see that sometimes on Mazda RX-7s because they were rear wheel drive, you know.
Rotary engine.
It's rotary engine, yeah, but the transmission was just plain old transmission. And, you know, we'd pull that, you know, replace that bearing and it'd quiet it right on down. And now I will tell you something else. You can have either in differentials or in manual transmissions gears that are noisy, and you cannot take those transmissions apart and look at those gears and see anything wrong with them. I'm talking about whining gears. And my dad, whenever, you know, my dad had a little shop that he ran, sort of one-man shop he ran for a long time. I mean, like 30 years or something. And I would be in his shop one time when I was a teenager, and people would come over there with a transmission out of a vehicle, and they'd say, "This transmission's making a whining noise, can you fix it for me?" And he'd say, "Not like that. I got to have it in the car. I want to drive it, and I want to hear it." And they'd say, "Well, why do you need to do that?" He said, "Because you can take that thing apart and you can look at those gears and you can't tell which one of them are noisy. They'll be mismatched a little bit, but they'll just whine up a storm, and you look at them, they're just as polished and smooth and pretty, and they fit together good and all that." So those gears are weird, okay? I mean, especially those helical cut and hypoid gears. Hypoid gears are the ones like you have in a rear end, where the pinion is going in above or below the center line. And the helical cut gears are the ones with the curved teeth. The straight teeth, the spur gears, are inherently noisy anyway. How many of you ever noticed that when you put a car in reverse and back it up, it goes, it whines, but it's quiet going forward? I mean, even if it's a nice late model vehicle, it'll do that. Okay. Now then, so there's a lot of different types of manual transmission system. Most of them got the same basic components. And the following are basic descriptions of the systems that will be covered here. You got a clutch. What's that clutch for? Tell me in a few words what the clutch is for.
Couples and couples engine.
That's a good point. There you go. When you crank the engine for starting, it's got to be disconnected from the transmission. What happens if it's not?
Then you start stripping stuff.
Yeah. What happens back in the early 80s, no car was really required to have a clutch switch on it. I mean, a lot of brand new cars that come out, if it was a standard transmission, they feel like if you're too stupid to mash the clutch when you start, you deserve whatever happens, you know. But then they came out a law where you had to have a, you know, a clutch switch on it to keep people from, you know, running over something. One day when I was working at the Volkswagen place in 1983, there was this guy that pulled the car in. When I pulled the car in on my lift, I left it in neutral. And I actually moved it around by hand, you know, to get it right on the lift before I raised it up. That was at the Volkswagen dealership. And so, and it was this 83 Volkswagen GTI that one of these, another guy pulled in there. He was playing service advisor that day or something, and he pulled it in there on my lift, and he left the darn thing in first gear. And but I mean, you just you're a creature of habits. You see, you do everything the same way every time. And so I was used to having these things in neutral every time I parked him in there. When he parked it, he left it in first gear. He got out, and I did some work on the engine. I don't remember what I did. I think I can't even remember. I had to do some kind of valve cover gasket or something. It didn't take very long. And he says, "Hey, you needed to set the idle speed too." And he was kind of standing over to the side. And it was the building was one like this one here with concrete block walls. And that car that I was working on was about as far as from Gonzales to that wall right there, from the wall. On the other side of the wall was the lady that did the office work. And so I said, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that." And I reached in there and I started that car up. It didn't have a clutch switch because it didn't come with one. And it was in first gear, and it took off and ran into the wall. And if everybody had been standing there, it broke their legs. See what I'm saying? But nobody was. Okay, so it ran into the wall, it broke the wall, pushed it away, pushed the file cabinets away, and the lady in the office was like, "Woo!" She thought the building was coming down. And I guess if you went over there right now, that wall's probably still caved in, you know. But the Volkswagen place now is over there where that Hometown Motors is in Enterprise, you know. Mm-hmm. That's where I worked for a while. But anyway, the long and the short of it was no clutch switch. You start it up, it's going somewhere. Okay. All right. Transmission's engaged to run an engine when the vehicle stops. The engine's going to stall and call. How many of you see somebody don't know how to drive a standard transmission, or you forgot that you're driving a standard transmission, you just mashed the brake and all of a sudden it cuts off, you see.
I seen that in Shirley the other day. There was a guy jerking the whole car down the highway.
Yep. There was a guy one time that had a Power Stroke diesel, and sometimes when I was at the Ford place over there, they would call me up there to get a customer calmed down that was mad, even if I didn't work on the truck. You know, so the guys, we had a porter, and this porter would drive the customer's truck around here, and he would stop outside the service area when it was time to go to pick up truck. Well, this guy brought this Power Stroke diesel truck up there because when he went to take off on it, there was something that wasn't quite right about the engine, and it would you know, and he didn't like that, so he brought it in to have it fixed under warranty. So he brought, and it was the guy that was driving the truck around, the porter wasn't very good at driving a stick. And so when he pulled it around, he pulled it up there to stop, because he didn't know how to drive it, it was doing the same thing. And the guy just knew it wasn't fixed. So he was all hot and bothered and irritated and aggravated. And I didn't even work on the daggum truck. But whenever they had somebody that was all ticked off and hot and angry and mad, they would say, can you come in up here and see if you can calm this customer down? So I went up there. And so, I mean, this guy was just cussing the blue streak, all that kind of stuff. And let's see, let me see, Donna. All right, you put that other one on my desk so we don't mind their shoes. And anyhow, so I got in the truck with him, driving it, and me and him drove around the mall. And he was really just ranting and raving and carrying on. I just listened to him. I just drove the truck and listened to him. And every time I took off, it took off smooth, you know. So we took off smooth and we drove.
Did you all take the Crown Vic back?
Yeah, we drove it over there.
Thank you. You give her the key? Appreciate you.
Okay. But anyway, so after we drove around a little bit, and he has pretty well expended all of his anger, I says, well, you know, I had a VCR one time that didn't work right, no VHS tape VCR, and I sent that thing off to North American Phillips in Atlanta, and they charged me $100, and when I got it back, it still wasn't fixed. And he goes, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And then we sort of had a common beef. And he said, well, it seems like the truck is doing better than it was. I'll bring it back if it's giving any more trouble. And I said, that'd be a good thing. Well, you calm the guy down, you know, just let him spew all of his venom and everything. There was another guy over there that pulled a gun on the shop foreman one day when he told him what went wrong with his truck. I never had that happen to me, but you don't want to relive that. Okay, you got to uncouple from the transmission, right? Okay, we all seen pictures of the clutch, right? Now, I have got a worksheet that some of you probably have on your board. I've got a manual transmission on there, M50D, come out of like a 2000 Ford pickup. And it's been took apart and put back together a lot of times, but you're basically just going to get your hands on it and you're going to get it all took apart, and you're going to spread it out on the table, and you're going to let me see it, and then you're going to put it back together. And there's actually some really good instructions on it. That's the worksheet on that. And the transmission it's one that I've had for a pretty good while. Now, a manual transaxle, let me tell you about a transmission power flow. Right quick. We're going to do that right quick. And there's more to this than just filling out the test. Power coming in from the engine goes here, right? Okay, you got a gear right here. All right, you got a cluster gear right here. Now, as you go back, these gears get bigger. Got me? Mm-hmm. All right, and as you go back on here, that one there, excuse me, I didn't draw that right. This gear is big, and that gear is smaller, and that gear is smaller. This is like a couple of Christmas trees you got laid side by side. You got me? Okay. Now then, this shaft coming in from the engine is broken right here. Right? Anytime that engine's running, this gear is meshed with that gear. This gear is all one piece. It does not have any gears that will rotate freely on it on a regular transmission, like what we're used to seeing right here. Okay, so what you got right here, and you got this big one here, and a big one here, and a big one here. Okay, now outside the bearing case, you got a bearing case here, and you got a bearing case here. That bearing that I was talking about earlier is right here. It's the one around that shaft coming in from the engine. That's power coming in. Now, when you're in first gear, can somebody tell me what power flow is in first gear? If you was to draw it, where would you go? The power is going to come in, it's spinning this, all right, you got a clutch right here, it's going to slide, and it's going to lock that gear to this shaft.
Oh, so it'll be working like on the thing the other day. It's going to be in the front and the back.
Yeah, it's going to come down here, it's going to go back here, it's going to go up here, and it's going to go out. That gear is turning that gear is turning that gear, but the size of this gear is going to determine your gear ratio. So you can have a lot of turns here and not many here. That's like 4 to 1, 4 of these to 1 of those. Then whenever you shift that forward, if you ever get it in 2 gears at once, it locks down solid and you ain't going nowhere. It's just like a solid piece of steel. All right, but when you move that one from there to there, you disengage that one, you lock this one to the shaft, and that's going to make the power flow go through this one, that one, this one. You see the difference in the ratios? You know, this is little, big. Bigger, not quite so big. You see how you're going back? That's your ratios. In the very back here, that's where your 5th gear is. You see, that's how that's gonna work. So all that's gonna be on the backside. Daniel's got a transmission like that tore down, and he will have it put back together soon, so I can actually show you on the bench how all that kind of stuff works, right? Okay, so, we got the gears laying back here. Now that's how that works. Now, a manual transaxle is different from that. There's one right over there. See that one, them gears sticking up? That manual transaxle over there is something that we've got a special study that we do on manual transaxle, so I'm gonna wait till we get into that before we dig too much into that. Okay, now let's look at half shafts. Why do we have to have these half shafts? You know these shafts like, Abby, like y'all pull out of your car, it's got those boots on each end. You know, the little shaft with a splunge, you popped them out, they're about this long. They got little accordion looking boots. Right? Why you gotta have that?
Transfers power to the front wheels on a front wheel drive vehicle.
I know, why do they need to be made the way they are made though? The inside one, and this is something everybody needs to think about too, your drive shaft on a rear wheel drive vehicle or the half shafts on a front wheel drive vehicle have got to be able to transmit motion through a lot of ranges of, you know, the front wheel drive more so. In other words, as it turns, it's still got to be able to, you know, drive while it's, you know, not straight. You can't just have a straight pipe going out there if you're going to be turning the wheels. So you're going to have the inside joint on a CV axle is going to plunge. That means it's going to enable that shaft to get longer and shorter with suspension geometry changes. See, as the car bounces up and down, that shaft has got to get longer and shorter. Get what I'm saying? I mean, because your wheels out here, if a wheel's going up and down, you know, your shaft's got to get longer and shorter. Okay, now on a drive shaft, you might notice, and you probably know that, on your slip yoke that slides up into the transmission, you pull them drive shafts out, haven't you? It's got long splines. And they got and as the suspension geometry, some of them will just have coming right out of the back of the transmission, they'll go to a hanger bearing, and then they'll have a slip yoke there. But whatever happens is, as those axles are going over bumps, that drive shaft has got to be able to transmit that turning motion while it's getting longer and shorter while you're going over the bump, see? All that stuff's got to be factored in, or it's going to bind everything up. And all that. Here's another thing. If you're checking a drive shaft, how many of you have ever changed out a U-joint? You change out a U-joint. How do you know the U-joints are bad? What are your symptoms? Why did you ever go there to begin with?
Because your drive shaft drops.
You mean a universal joint?
Yeah.
That's because it's loose, it shakes.
Yeah, or it can be dry and tight, and it will cause a vibration. Or sometimes it'll go click, 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 and then you put it in reverse, it goes clack, 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 or squeak, 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 you know, it changes. And so sometimes, you know, drive shafts don't typically fall out, but what happens is you'll feel something that you don't like, and what we always going to do on a situation like that, and you guys remember this because you're going to be doing it in the shop, you're going to pull the drive shaft out and you're going to feel them U-joints and see if they're stiff or if they've got slack. You won't always see it. You cannot always tell a U-joint needs to be replaced by just looking at the drive shaft. I mean, not in the truck. If you got it in your hand, you can tell. You can actually wiggle it sometimes. If it's not worn out, if it's actually dry, so that those little rollers in there have worn little brindles in the, you know, the shaft, I mean, the part they're supposed to ride on, you're still going to have to pull it off. You got to feel of them. And a lot of times they'll be tight one way and loose the other. Now, on steering and suspension, some of your steering shafts, like on these Nissans, like an Altima, this lady says, my car don't drive the way it used to, and I can't explain it. What do you do with something like that? It just don't drive right. Something don't feel right about the way it drives. I'm talking about the way it steers. And so I drive it, and she had a U-joint in her steering shaft, right there where it goes into the rack and pinion. And when I pull that thing out of there, it was real stiff one way and real loose the other way. So every time she turned past that stiff area, it'd go, it was hard and easy and hard and easy and hard and easy. And I've still got that piece out there for you to look at. But I mean, that was like a 05 or 06 Altima. So it's not like an old wore out, you know, something from the 60s that this happened on. But you got to be able to troubleshoot that kind of stuff and tell what you need to do to fix it instead of just saying, I don't know. You see, I mean, that's basically the deeper you go, the deeper you get. Okay, now then, anybody got any questions that we didn't answer here? The path power takes from the engine to the wheels is what? Power flow. Power flow. Okay, and you got some matching questions there? One, provides differential action on front wheel drive vehicles. Manual transaxle transfers power from the front wheels to the front wheels on front wheel drive vehicles. Yeah, and then multiplies torque on rear wheel drive vehicles.
Manual transmission.
That's gonna be A, and then finally couples and uncouples the engine from the transmission out of there. It's really dirt easy. All right. Now, did anybody get something out of this that you didn't know when you came in here?
Yep.
Are you glad you came in here?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
I'm sure. All right. Well, we can resume, and we've got about 45 minutes until lunch. Hey.